Welcome everyone to another study session. This video is more like a continuation of the previous one where I was studying the proportions of the skull. I had drawn a front, side and a 3/4 view, along with making lots of notes and figuring out an easy method to then draw the skull on many angles, which is what I'm going to be doing in this video. I'm going to draw 50 skulls on various angles from my imagination. Although not all of these are drawn from my imagination, I did at times have to glance at a model of the skull on my computer screen that I was using as reference, especially when it came to the more complex angles, but I did try to avoid doing that because, again, I want to challenge myself and know the skull well enough to be able to draw solely from my imagination. Anyways, I will explain how I approach all of these in a moment, but before I do, let me discuss a few things. Firstly, if you have watched the previous study session, you will know that I was using a proportional system by Loomis, where the skull is divided into 3 units. I was also referring to the Stonehouse anatomy book, so these skulls I was drawing were like a hybrid of both of these, which I think resulted in a good looking skull. Now, I really like this method involving 3 divisions because not only is it easy to remember, but in his book, Drawing the Head and Hands, he also shows you how these divisions can be applied when drawing heads on different angles, and that's also an easy method which is well known. You start by drawing a ball and defining the angle of that ball with some cross contours. These contour lines act as the dividing lines you can use to position the features, but of course the head isn't just a ball, so the next step is to add a chin section down from that. And I'm just giving a real brief example here. I will likely go into all of this more in depth in its own video, but the reason why I'm saying this is because that's how I started to draw these skulls on screen. You can see how I always begin with that ball and I draw some contour lines which wrap around it, establishing an angle for me to then draw the skull on. And you know, after doing this a few times, I started to get a better feel for it. Like I was able to visualize the skull I was about to draw once I knew the angle I was going to draw it on. Now, whilst this is an easy method to learn, it was still quite challenging, especially when I attempted to draw the skull on more uncommon angles, like from underneath looking up or from the back. Again, if you are familiar with the skull, you'll know that it's actually a lot wider from a side than it might appear from the front, so I was frequently working outside of that ball to create a shape that's more suitable. Also, before I even attempted to draw these, I made sure to familiarise myself with the overall form of the skull. It's very important to know a lot about what you are drawing in order to draw it more accurately. That's why studying anatomy in itself is very important. Like when I was drawing these, I was often referring to the pages of notes that I had created in the previous video, looking at the position of these features and how they appear. The zygomatic bones, for instance, curve around the side of the skull, and if you looked at them from above, you'd see that it creates an arc shape, almost like a handle on either side. The eye sockets as well, they are pushing into the skull, you know, they look like they are curving into it, and between these there's a rather flat section above the nasal bone, and the nasal bone, that's a very small bone which extrudes out from the top of the curved nasal aperture. You'll see this on a 3/4 view, for example. This bone extrudes out and covers the eye socket behind it. The nasal aperture, what looks like an upside down love heart, I think that's how I explained it in the previous video, you know, that takes up the lower half of that middle unit and also curves in and then out again at the bottom. You can see on some of these skulls that I'm drawing how I block in a curved section between the maxilla bone and the mandible where the teeth would usually go. It doesn't really make sense for me to draw all those teeth when I'm drawing skulls at this scale, so I just add some lines there. This curved shape meets the bottom of the mandible, which is then angled back up to the side of the skull. Again, a lot of this is explained in the previous video when I talk about the proportions and go over some general anatomy, but as I do this, there is a lot to consider, but I found that it definitely became a lot easier and almost habitual the more that I did it. There were some that I weren't as happy with, but I didn't get too hung up on them because I had to draw 50 of them and the skull can look rather strange on some angles. I was trying to focus on representing its overall form more, which was hard sometimes because some of these looked rather flat. I think to express the form of the skull is most important though, because after all it forms the shape of a head that you might be drawing. Later down the line when I look at adding some cartilage and muscles to the skull, I'm expecting to learn a lot more about it, like how these bones affect the appearance of facial features. There is a lot involved and I'm trying to approach it all in a manageable way, step by step, video by video. I'll cover everything eventually. Also, if you don't know already, I mentioned in a previous video that I'm going to cover the skeleton first and get to a point where I can confidently pose and draw the skeletal figure from my imagination before I start to cover the muscles. At least that's what I have in mind, but that always might change. Anyways, I think that I have explained as much as I can here. Again, a lot of the general anatomy was explained in the previous video. Here I'm just continuing to make use of that information and draw these skulls on many angles, and I approach all of these the same way, so I think you'll benefit more from just watching. Anyways, I'll let this continue to play out. As always, I'll be posting the study session pages on Patreon, so if you want access to them then be sure to check that out. With all that being said, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the content I create, then do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You will gain access to exclusive tutorials, study documents, process papers, real-time drawing footage and more. Plus you will also be supporting me in a more personal way. Other than that, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you soon.